The red clay roads of Plains, Georgia, shimmer under a soft morning sun, stretching between fields of peanuts that rustle gently in a warm breeze. A young boy walks barefoot along a dusty path, his hands calloused from working the land, his eyes fixed on the horizon beyond the wiregrass and longleaf pines. This is the world that shaped Jimmy Carter, a place where dawn broke to the sound of roosters and the scent of boiling peanuts filled the wooden farmhouse. In this quiet corner of the American South, life moved at the rhythm of the seasons, teaching patience, humility, and the dignity of hard work. Carter's father, Earl, ran a tight farm and country store, while his mother, Lillian, a nurse, crossed the color line to care for neighbors in need, instilling in her son a quiet sense of justice. The Carter home had no electricity or running water until Jimmy was a teenager, and the outhouse, kerosene lamps, and hand-pumped well were daily reminders of a simple, grounded existence. This rustic upbringing forged a character marked by discipline and empathy, laying the foundation for a life of service that would one day reach the White House. From these humble roots, Carter ventured far beyond the peanut fields, earning an appointment to the United States Naval Academy in 1943. The disciplined halls of Annapolis, with their gray stone walls and echoing footsteps, introduced him to a world of engineering, duty, and precision. Graduating in the top 10% of his class, he entered the elite nuclear submarine program under the demanding Admiral Hyman Rickover, a man who famously asked Carter whether he had always done his best, a question that would haunt and drive him for decades. Stationed in places like Hawaii and upstate New York, Carter worked on the cutting edge of Cold War technology, surrounded by the hum of reactors and the cold steel of submarine hulls. Yet when his father died in 1953, Carter made a wrenching decision to resign his commission and return to Plains, leaving behind a promising naval career to rescue the family farm. The transition was jarring. One moment he was in a crisply pressed uniform, the next he was back in overalls, sorting seed peanuts in a tin-roofed warehouse while the Georgia sun beat down through dusty windows. This return to the land reconnected him with the rhythms of rural life and the struggles of small farmers, deepening his understanding of ordinary Americans. As the Carter family business slowly recovered, Jimmy's attention turned to the community around him. He served on the local school board and hospital authority, witnessing firsthand the lingering injustices of segregation and the poverty that gripped many of his neighbors. The Plains of his childhood was changing, but not fast enough, and Carter felt a growing conviction that he could do more. In 1962, he ran for the Georgia State Senate, campaigning in small churches and country stores, his wife Rosalind by his side. The election was marred by fraud, but Carter fought in court and won, beginning a political journey marked by dogged persistence. In the state capitol, he earned a reputation as a reformer, streamlining government and promoting education, often working late into the night under the gold dome of Atlanta's Capitol building. His quiet, methodical approach contrasted with the bombastic style of many Southern politicians, and his refusal to join segregationist groups signaled a new kind of leadership. The fluorescent-lit committee rooms and echoing marble hallways became his new terrain, but he never lost the plain-spoken manner of a peanut farmer. In 1970, Carter won the governorship of Georgia, and his inaugural address stunned the state when he declared that the time for racial discrimination was over. Standing on the steps of the Capitol, with the winter sun casting long shadows, he spoke of a new South, one defined by opportunity and equality. His administration hung portraits of Martin Luther King Jr. in the State House, reorganized the bureaucracy, and championed environmental protection, but his most enduring legacy was perhaps the quiet integration of state government. The governor's mansion, a Greek revival home with towering columns and magnolia trees, became a place of earnest, sometimes awkward, transformation. Carter's term was not without its limits. His technocratic style could seem aloof, and his ambitious reforms sometimes alienated traditional allies. Yet he emerged as a symbol of a changing region, a moderate who believed that good government could heal old wounds. The experience prepared him for a larger stage, as the nation grappled with the aftermath of Vietnam and Watergate. By 1976, America was weary of scandal and cynicism, and Carter's outsider message resonated deeply. He campaigned for the presidency as a humble peanut farmer and born-again Christian, promising a government as good as its people. Traveling the country with a small team, he stayed in supporters' homes, carrying his own garment bag and speaking in town halls where the light filtered through dusty windows onto folding chairs. His smile, broad and unassuming, became a symbol of trustworthiness. In the Iowa caucuses and New Hampshire primary, his relentless retail politics paid off, and he secured the Democratic nomination. The general election against Gerald Ford was close, but Carter's pledge never to lie to the American people struck a chord. On election night, under the glare of television lights in a Plains warehouse, the returns showed a narrow victory, and the long journey from the peanut fields to the presidency was complete. The nation, it seemed, was ready for a leader who walked with a quiet step and carried the lessons of a small town into the corridors of power. The Catoctin mountain air is crisp and still, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth through the screened windows of Aspen Lodge. In September 1978, the presidential retreat of Camp David became a secluded stage for one of the most remarkable diplomatic efforts of the 20th century. Jimmy Carter, dressed in a casual cardigan instead of a suit, walked the wooded paths each morning, gathering his thoughts among the oak and hickory trees that stood like silent witnesses. The lodge itself, a rustic yet comfortable structure with stone fireplaces and overstuffed chairs, offered a stark contrast to the formal palaces where peace talks usually occurred. Here, Carter hoped to do what had seemed impossible: bring together Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin to forge a lasting peace. The two leaders arrived with decades of mistrust between their nations, and the early days were filled with tense silences and sharp exchanges. Carter, ever the patient mediator, moved between their cabins like a country doctor making house calls, listening to grievances under the soft glow of table lamps and the crackle of a log fire. The isolation of the mountain retreat, with its winding paths and distant bird calls, created a pressure cooker of proximity, forcing the three men to confront not just political positions, but personal histories. Carter's approach was methodical and deeply personal. He had studied the issues for months, compiling thick briefing books and psychological profiles of the two leaders. In the mornings, he would sit with Sadat on the deck, watching the fog lift from the valley, discussing the Egyptian leader's vision of a comprehensive settlement. Sadat, a tall man with a warm smile and dramatic flair, spoke of recovering the Sinai Peninsula, but also of a new era for the Middle East. In the afternoons, Carter would walk with Begin through the birch groves, listening to the Israeli Prime Minister's meticulous concerns about security and recognition. Begin, a former underground fighter with a formal demeanor, was wary of grand gestures, preferring to argue over every word of the proposed text. The American president navigated these contrasting personalities with a blend of empathy and stubbornness, often staying up late into the night in his study, poring over maps and draft agreements by the light of a green-shaded desk lamp. The work was exhausting, and there were moments when the entire effort seemed on the verge of collapse. At one point, Sadat ordered his bags packed, and Begin retreated into a stony silence. Yet Carter refused to let them leave, believing that a breakthrough was within reach if they could only endure the process a little longer. The turning point came not in the conference room, but on a personal tour of the Gettysburg battlefield, which Carter arranged to break the deadlock. On a cool, overcast afternoon, the three leaders walked the hallowed ground where Americans had once fought each other, the rolling hills and stone monuments a quiet testament to the cost of conflict. The sight of the graves and the weight of history seemed to soften something in both Sadat and Begin. Back at Camp David, Carter introduced a single, comprehensive American proposal, and then, in a moment of personal diplomacy, he visited Begin's cabin to make a final appeal. He found the Prime Minister preparing to leave, but Carter had brought signed photographs for Begin's grandchildren, each inscribed with their names, a gesture that moved Begin to tears. In that small, wood-paneled room, with the evening shadows gathering outside, the last barriers began to crumble. Begin agreed to present the framework to his cabinet, and Sadat, ever the statesman, signaled his acceptance. The resulting Camp David Accords, signed on September 17, 1978, in the East Room of the White House, established a framework for peace that included Israel's withdrawal from the Sinai and a path toward Palestinian autonomy. It was a triumph of patient, principled mediation, and it showcased Carter's belief that even the deepest divides could be bridged through dialogue and personal connection. Yet the accords were not a complete peace. The broader issues of Palestinian statehood and the status of Jerusalem remained unresolved, and the agreement's limitations would fuel criticism for years to come. Some argued that Carter had focused too narrowly on the Egyptian-Israeli track, leaving the Palestinian question to fester. The subsequent decades brought new wars and intifadas, and the promise of Camp David often seemed like a distant memory. Nevertheless, the treaty between Egypt and Israel has endured, a testament to the framework built in those tense September days. The image of three former enemies standing together on the White House lawn, bathed in the golden light of a late summer afternoon, remains a powerful symbol of what diplomacy can achieve. For Carter, the experience reinforced his conviction that personal engagement, patience, and a willingness to understand the other side's narrative are the essential tools of peacemaking. The mountain retreat returned to its quiet existence, but the echoes of those conversations, the whispered negotiations under the pines, the shared meals in the rustic dining room, the solitary walks along the leaf-strewn paths, lingered as a reminder that, even in a world of complex conflicts, determined leadership can bend the arc of history toward reconciliation. Imagine the quiet corridors of the West Wing in the early hours of a November morning in 1979. The soft hum of fluorescent lights casts long shadows across the empty halls, and the air is still, heavy with the weight of decisions yet to be made. Outside, the Washington sky is a pale gray, and bare branches scratch against the windows. This was the world Jimmy Carter inhabited as his presidency entered its most trying chapter, a period defined not by the triumphs of Camp David, but by crises that would test the very core of his character. The Iran hostage crisis and economic stagflation became the twin storms that buffeted his final years in office, challenging his leadership and ultimately shaping his legacy in ways no one could have predicted. In the spring of 1979, the Iranian Revolution had already toppled the Shah, a longtime U.S. ally, and installed an Islamic republic under Ayatollah Khomeini. Carter's decision to allow the exiled Shah into the United States for medical treatment in October ignited a firestorm of anti-American sentiment in Tehran. On November 4th, a group of militant students stormed the U.S. Embassy, taking 52 Americans hostage. The world watched in disbelief as the crisis unfolded, and the television screens in American living rooms were filled with images of blindfolded hostages and burning flags. Carter, deeply committed to a peaceful resolution, refused to yield to military pressure, instead pursuing diplomatic channels and imposing economic sanctions. His restraint was born of a profound belief in the sanctity of human life, but to many Americans, it appeared as weakness, a failure of strength in the face of brazen aggression. As the days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the hostage crisis became a national obsession. The evening news was anchored by the grim count of days since the hostages were taken, and yellow ribbons became a symbol of collective anguish. Carter's own life became consumed by the crisis. He rarely left the White House, spending countless hours in the Situation Room, poring over intelligence reports and exploring every possible avenue for negotiation. The failed rescue mission in April 1980, Operation Eagle Claw, ended in tragedy when a helicopter collided with a transport plane in the Iranian desert, killing 8 servicemen. The dust and smoke rising from the wreckage seemed to mirror the clouds settling over Carter's presidency. The mission's failure was a devastating blow, both personally and politically, reinforcing the narrative of an administration unable to project power effectively. Simultaneously, the American economy was suffering from a malaise that seemed as intractable as the hostage crisis. Stagflation, a toxic mix of high inflation and stagnant economic growth, eroded the purchasing power of ordinary families. Gasoline lines snaked around blocks, and the price of everyday goods climbed relentlessly. Carter, a student of policy, attempted to address the crisis with a combination of spending cuts and energy reforms, but his efforts often seemed out of step with the public's pain. In a famous speech in July 1979, he spoke of a crisis of confidence in the American spirit, a message that was intended to inspire but was widely perceived as blaming the people for the nation's problems. The speech, delivered from the Oval Office with its familiar bookshelves and soft lamplight, failed to rally the country. Instead, it deepened the sense that Carter was a leader adrift, unable to steer the ship of state through turbulent waters. Through it all, Carter's dedication to human rights never wavered, even as it complicated his political standing. He continued to speak out against oppression around the globe, and his administration pressed for democratic reforms in countries from Latin America to Asia. This moral consistency was a hallmark of his worldview, a thread that ran from his early days as a Sunday school teacher in Plains, Georgia, to the highest office in the land. Yet, in the crucible of the 1980 election, these principles were overshadowed by the immediate crises. The contrast with his opponent, Ronald Reagan, was stark. Where Carter offered solemn, detailed analysis, Reagan projected sunny optimism and simple solutions. On Election Day, the American people chose a new direction, and Carter suffered a decisive defeat, winning only 6 states and the District of Columbia. In the final hours of his presidency, Carter worked tirelessly to secure the release of the hostages, a goal that was achieved only moments after Reagan was sworn in on January 20, 1981. The timing was a final, poignant irony. His greatest burden was lifted, but the credit belonged to another. As he left the Capitol, the winter light was thin and pale, casting long shadows on the steps where he had once taken the oath of office. The criticism of his handling of the crises would linger, but so too would the recognition of his unwavering commitment to peace. The Iran hostage crisis and economic stagflation had defined his final years in office, but they did not define the man. His presidency ended not with a bang, but with the quiet dignity of a leader who had done his best under impossible circumstances, a prelude to a different kind of service yet to come. The Georgia sun hung low over the small town of Plains in the spring of 1982, casting long, golden shadows across the peanut fields that had once been Jimmy Carter's world. After the tumult of Washington, he and Rosalind returned to the modest ranch house they had built 2 decades earlier, a home far removed from the marble halls of power. The quiet rhythms of rural life resumed, the creak of the porch swing, the rustle of pine needles, and the distant call of a bobwhite. Yet, within this tranquil setting, a new vision was taking root. Carter was not content to simply fade into retirement. Instead, he began to sketch the blueprints for what would become the Carter Center, an institution dedicated not to political power, but to humanitarian influence, driven by a deep moral commitment to alleviate suffering and foster peace. The idea for the center emerged from a desire to extend the work he had begun in the White House, particularly in the realms of conflict resolution and human rights. In the early days, the center was little more than a small office in Atlanta, with a handful of staff and a big dream. Carter threw himself into the work with the same discipline and attention to detail that had marked his naval career and his presidency. He spent hours at a simple wooden desk, writing letters to world leaders, studying maps of conflict zones, and consulting with experts on public health. The office was bathed in the soft light of a desk lamp, surrounded by shelves of books and the quiet hum of a nascent organization. It was here that the seeds of a new legacy were sown, one that would grow far beyond the confines of a single term in office. From the outset, the Carter Center focused on 3 core areas: conflict resolution, disease eradication, and election monitoring. Carter believed that peace was not merely the absence of war, but the presence of justice and health. In conflict zones from Sudan to Bosnia, he offered his services as a mediator, often traveling to remote villages where the only light came from kerosene lamps and the air was thick with the dust of unpaved roads. His approach was personal and persistent. He would sit with rebel leaders and heads of state alike, listening more than he spoke, seeking common ground. The center's election monitoring efforts, which began in Panama in 1989, aimed to ensure that the will of the people was respected, sending observers to polling stations around the globe, where the simple act of casting a ballot became a beacon of hope. One of the center's most remarkable undertakings was the campaign to eradicate Guinea worm disease, a parasitic infection that had plagued millions in Africa and Asia. When Carter first learned of the disease, it was a neglected scourge, afflicting the poorest of the poor in remote areas without access to clean water. The Carter Center took on the challenge with a practical, hands-on strategy, teaching communities to filter their drinking water through simple cloth filters and educating them about the disease's life cycle. Carter himself visited countless villages, walking through dusty fields under a blazing sun, his figure a familiar sight in a simple short-sleeved shirt and a wide-brimmed hat. The work was unglamorous but effective, and over the decades, cases plummeted from millions to a mere handful, a triumph of persistence and compassion. The center's headquarters in Atlanta became a hub of quiet diplomacy and tireless advocacy. The building itself, with its clean lines and sunlit atriums, reflected the clarity of purpose that Carter brought to his post-presidential life. Here, staff members worked late into the evening, their faces illuminated by computer screens as they tracked disease outbreaks or coordinated peace talks. The walls were adorned with photographs of Carter meeting with villagers in Ghana, observing elections in Nepal, and embracing children in Ethiopia. Each image told a story of a man who had traded the trappings of power for the tools of service, finding a deeper satisfaction in the smiles of those he helped than in any political victory. Yet, this new legacy was not without its critiques. Some argued that Carter's freelance diplomacy sometimes undermined official U.S. foreign policy, as when he engaged with rogue regimes or made statements that contradicted sitting administrations. His willingness to talk to anyone, a hallmark of his approach, occasionally drew sharp rebukes from Washington. But Carter remained undeterred, guided by his belief that personal engagement could break through barriers that official channels could not. He often quoted the biblical imperative to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly, a creed that shaped both his triumphs and his controversies. In the end, the Carter Center stood as a testament to the idea that a former president could be more than a ceremonial figure. He could be a force for tangible good, one village, one election, one patient at a time. As the years passed, the Carter Center's work expanded, but its founder never lost sight of the individual human beings at the heart of its mission. Whether he was building a house with Habitat for Humanity or negotiating a ceasefire, Carter approached each task with the same earnest determination. The transition from political power to humanitarian influence was complete, and it had been forged not in the spotlight of the White House, but in the quiet, persistent labor of a man who believed that every person deserved a life of dignity. The sun would set over the fields of plains, and a new day would dawn, bringing with it the promise of a world made slightly better by the work of a peanut farmer who became a peacemaker. In the quiet, sun-drenched fields of a village in South Sudan, the early morning light casts long shadows across the dusty earth. A small group of health workers, led by an elderly man with a gentle smile and a worn baseball cap, moves slowly among the thatched huts. This is Jimmy Carter, far from the marble halls of Washington, now in his 8th decade, kneeling beside a young child. He carefully extracts a thin, white worm from the child's foot, a Guinea worm, coiling it around a small stick. The air is warm and still, filled with the scent of dry grass and the distant murmur of villagers. It is a scene of quiet, painstaking labor, a battle waged not with armies, but with patience and compassion, in the shadow of a disease that has plagued humanity for millennia. Carter's post-presidential years became defined by this kind of hands-on engagement. Through the Carter Center, founded in 1982, he turned his attention to some of the world's most intractable problems. He believed deeply in the power of personal diplomacy, often traveling to remote and volatile regions to mediate conflicts. In 1994, he flew to North Korea at a time of soaring tensions over nuclear weapons and met with Kim Il-sung. Walking through the austere, tree-lined avenues of Pyongyang, Carter negotiated a framework that temporarily froze the nuclear program and averted a potential military crisis. His approach was direct and unassuming, relying on face-to-face conversation in modest rooms, a stark contrast to the formal statecraft of larger nations. He saw himself as a peacemaker, not a president, free to listen and build trust without the weight of official power. In Haiti, the same year, Carter's mediation helped prevent a bloodbath. As U.S. forces prepared to invade to restore the elected president, Carter, along with General Colin Powell and Senator Sam Nunn, flew to Port-au-Prince. In the sweltering heat of a colonial-era mansion, they negotiated with the military junta. The rooms were dim, the tension palpable, but Carter's calm persistence eventually secured an agreement for a peaceful transfer of power. Outside, the streets were tense and quiet, the air heavy with humidity and fear. His success in these missions stemmed from a genuine belief that even the most entrenched adversaries could find common ground, if given the space and respect to do so. He often spoke of the need to understand the other side's perspective, a lesson drawn from his own deep faith and his upbringing in the rural South. Yet perhaps his most remarkable legacy was in the realm of disease eradication. When the Carter Center took on Guinea worm disease in 1986, there were an estimated 3.5 million cases annually across Africa and Asia. The parasite, ingested through contaminated water, grows inside the body for a year before emerging painfully through the skin. There is no vaccine, no cure, only prevention through education and simple water filters. Carter threw himself into the campaign, visiting thousands of villages, often walking miles through savanna and scrubland. In the golden light of late afternoon, he would sit with village elders, demonstrating how to filter water with cloth and pipe filters. His presence, a former American president kneeling in the dust, was a powerful symbol of commitment that galvanized global support and local action. The work was slow and meticulous. Teams trained by the Carter Center mapped every endemic village, distributing millions of filters and teaching communities to avoid contaminated ponds. In the cool, dark interiors of mud-brick huts, volunteers cared for patients, slowly extracting the worm over weeks. The number of cases plummeted. By the time Carter was in his 90s, the disease was on the brink of eradication, with only a handful of cases remaining in a few remote areas. This triumph, achieved without a single drug or injection, stands as one of the greatest public health achievements in history. It was a testament to Carter's belief in science, education, and the dignity of every human being, no matter how remote their village or how neglected their suffering. Carter's peacemaking and health work were not without controversy. His willingness to engage with dictators and rogue states drew sharp criticism from those who argued it legitimized oppressive regimes. Some analysts contended that his freelance diplomacy occasionally undercut official U.S. policy, creating confusion or yielding only short-term gains. These critiques remind us that even the most well-intentioned efforts can have complex consequences. Yet Carter remained steadfast, arguing that saving lives and preventing war required talking to anyone, without precondition. His approach was rooted in a profound moral conviction that peace is not a passive state but an active, often messy, process of engagement. In the soft, fading light of his long life, he continued to wage peace and fight disease, one village, one conversation, one worm at a time. On a crisp December morning in Oslo, the pale winter light filters through the tall windows of the city hall, illuminating the grand hall where the Nobel Peace Prize ceremony is about to begin. The room buzzes with quiet anticipation, dignitaries in dark suits and colorful national dress filling the seats. At the center, an elderly man with a familiar, gentle expression sits waiting. It is 2002, and Jimmy Carter is being honored not for a single act, but for decades of tireless work for peace and human rights. The Nobel Committee's citation praises his untiring effort to find peaceful solutions to international conflicts, to advance democracy and human rights, and to promote economic and social development. Outside, the fjord glistens under a low sun, and the city is calm, a fitting backdrop for a moment that recognizes a life of service beyond the presidency. Carter's acceptance speech that day reflected his core beliefs. He spoke of the growing divide between rich and poor, the necessity of peace, and the moral imperative to alleviate suffering. He did not shy away from criticizing powerful nations, including his own, for prioritizing war over human needs. His words, delivered in his measured Southern cadence, were not those of a triumphant politician, but of a man who had seen the face of war and poverty and felt compelled to act. The prize was a validation of his post-presidential path, a recognition that influence need not be tied to official power. It underscored his transformation from a one-term president often deemed a failure to a global elder statesman whose moral authority was widely respected. Even as he received the world's highest honor, Carter's daily life remained remarkably grounded. Back in Plains, Georgia, he and Rosalind lived in the same modest ranch house they had built in 1961. The home, shaded by tall pines and oaks, was a place of quiet routine, reading, writing, and planning the next Carter Center initiative. The surrounding town, with its single main street and peanut fields stretching to the horizon, was a world away from the corridors of power. Yet it was here that Carter found his anchor, teaching Sunday school at Maranatha Baptist Church well into his 90s. The small, white-clapboard church, filled with simple wooden pews and the soft light of stained glass, became a place of pilgrimage for visitors from around the world, drawn by the chance to hear a former president speak about faith, love, and service. Perhaps no activity better symbolized Carter's commitment to hands-on service than his work with Habitat for Humanity. For over 3 decades, he and Rosalind dedicated a week each year to building homes alongside volunteers and future homeowners. In the heat of summer, Carter, often in a hard hat and work gloves, could be seen hammering nails, sawing boards, and raising walls. The work sites, in cities from New York to Manila, were a blur of activity, the smell of fresh-cut lumber, the sound of hammers echoing, and the sight of sweat-soaked volunteers working together. It was not a photo opportunity, but a genuine expression of his belief in putting faith into action. Even in his 90s, after a cancer diagnosis and a fall, he returned to the build sites, his body frail, but his spirit undimmed, a silent testament to the dignity of labor and the power of community. Carter's later years were also marked by a quiet, reflective wisdom. He continued to write books, speak on issues of democracy and justice, and occasionally offer candid assessments of American politics. He remained a controversial figure, particularly for his outspoken criticism of Israeli policies and his meetings with leaders deemed pariahs by the West. Some argued that his moral clarity sometimes oversimplified complex geopolitical realities, and that his willingness to engage with authoritarian regimes risked lending them legitimacy. These critiques did not diminish his legacy, but they added a necessary layer of nuance to the narrative of a saintly elder. Carter himself acknowledged that peacemaking required difficult choices, and that he was not always right, but he never wavered in his conviction that dialogue was preferable to war. As the sun sets over the peanut fields of Plains, casting long, golden shadows across the quiet land, the legacy of Jimmy Carter comes into focus. He is not remembered as a perfect president, but as a man who redefined what a former leader can be. From the Camp David Accords to the near eradication of Guinea worm, from monitoring elections in distant lands to building homes with his own hands, he lived a life of remarkable consequence. His journey from a small Georgia town to the Nobel stage and back again is a story of humility, perseverance, and an unwavering commitment to the betterment of humankind. In the soft, fading light, the image endures, an elderly man, still teaching, still building, still waging peace, one day at a time.